July 1853. A human head floats in a glass jar filled with alcohol, displayed in a California mining camp. Men pay 50 cents each to stare at it, this supposed trophy of justice. The proprietor claims it belongs to Joaquín Murrieta, the most wanted outlaw in California, the Mexican Robin Hood, the terror of the gold rush. But nobody can confirm it's really him. Some of his former friends insist it's not. Others whisper that Joaquín Murrieta never died at all, that he escaped back to Mexico and laughed as Americans celebrated killing the wrong man. The truth was lost the moment that head was severed, and perhaps that's the point, because Joaquín Murrieta, whether he was one man or many, whether his story is history or legend, became something more powerful than any individual could be. He became a symbol of resistance against injustice, a hero to the oppressed, a ghost that haunted the conscience of Gold Rush California. This is his story. Or perhaps it's the story of how people created a legend to fight back when the law offered them no protection. Let's begin in Sonora, Mexico, around 1829. The exact date is uncertain because Mexican birth records from rural areas in that period are incomplete, and because the man we're talking about may have been several men whose stories merged into one legend. But the story as it's been passed down begins in Sonora, a state in northwestern Mexico characterized by dramatic landscapes where scorching deserts meet fertile river valleys, where the Sierra Madre Mountains create shadows across lands that glow red and gold in the setting sun. This is harsh country, but beautiful country, and the people who live here understand how to thrive in difficult conditions. Small pueblos dot the landscape, farming communities where families have lived for generations, where everyone knows everyone else, where life revolves around agriculture, ranching, family, and faith. These are not wealthy communities, but they're not desperately poor either. They're the backbone of Mexican society in this era. Hard-working people living with dignity, raising children, maintaining traditions, existing in that vast space between the very rich and the very poor that defined most people's lives in the early 19th century. Into one such family, a boy is born. We know him as Joaquín Murrieta, though even his name carries uncertainty. Was it Murrieta or Murrieta? Different sources spell it differently. Was his middle name Carrillo, as some accounts claim? We don't know for sure. What the legend tells us is that he grows up in a stable, loving home. His father is sometimes described as a rancher, sometimes as a farmer. His mother is devout and caring. He has siblings. The family isn't wealthy, but they have enough. Enough land, enough food, enough respect in their community. Young Joaquín learns the skills that boys in rural Sonora learned: riding horses, working with cattle, understanding the land and weather, basic literacy, if the family valued education. By all accounts, he becomes an exceptional horseman. This detail appears consistently across different versions of his story, suggesting it may be true. Horsemanship was crucial in this culture, both practically for ranching work and symbolically as a mark of masculine skill. A man who couldn't ride well was at a disadvantage. A man who rode exceptionally well earned respect. He also learns values that will shape his legend: honor, family loyalty, protecting those weaker than yourself, standing up to bullies and oppressors. These values were central to the Mexican cultural identity of this region, tied to both indigenous traditions and Spanish concepts of personal dignity and masculine honor. Whether Joaquín Murrieta actually embodied these values perfectly, or whether they were attributed to him by people who needed him to represent those ideals, we cannot definitively say. But they become inseparable from his legend. The young man grows to adulthood in Sonora, and at some point he marries. Her name was Rosora, or Carmen, or Rosita. Sources disagree. This disagreement itself tells us something important. The legend makers focused on Joaquín, but paid less attention to the woman beside him, as was typical in narratives of this era. She exists in the story primarily in relation to him, through what happens to her, rather than as a fully developed person in her own right. We know she was young, that she was beautiful by the standards of the time, that Joaquín loved her. Beyond that, she remains shadowy. They're building a life in Sonora when news reaches them that will change everything. January 1848, at Sutter's Mill in California, a carpenter named James W. Marshall spots something glinting in a water channel. He reaches down and picks up a nugget of gold. Within months, the news spreads across Mexico, South America, Asia, Europe. California, which Mexico had just lost to the United States in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed that February, is suddenly the land of opportunity. Gold is there for the taking, they say. A man can make his fortune in a single season if he's lucky and hard-working. The California gold rush begins, and it will transform the American West. In 1848, California's non-native population is about 14,000 people. By 1850, over 90,000. By 1852, over 250,000. This massive migration brings people from around the world, Americans from the East Coast and Midwest, Chinese workers, European adventurers, Australian sailors, South American miners, and Mexicans from states like Sonora, who had particular advantages. They were closer to California than most other gold seekers. They had mining experience from Mexico's own mineral wealth, and until very recently, California had been part of Mexico, so some Mexican migrants had family or friends already there. For Joaquín and his wife, the gold rush represents hope. They're young, probably in their early 20s. They want to build a better life. Mining for gold seems like a way to earn enough money to return to Sonora and live comfortably, to buy land, to raise children without financial worry. It's a dream shared by thousands of people from dozens of countries. Work hard for a few years in California, strike it rich, go home wealthy. So they make the decision. They'll go north to California. They'll join the gold rush. They'll find their fortune. The journey is difficult. From Sonora to California means crossing hundreds of miles of desert and mountain territory. Some migrants travel by ship, sailing down to Panama, crossing the isthmus by land, then sailing north again, a long and expensive route. Most Mexicans travel overland, which is cheaper but grueling. Joaquín and his wife likely joined a group of fellow Sonorans making the trek, traveling with pack animals, carrying supplies, moving slowly through hostile territory where Apache raids were a constant danger. After weeks or months of travel, they arrive in California. The exact location varies depending on which version of the story you follow. Some say they went to the southern mines near Sonora and Colombia. Others claim the Stanislaus River area. Still others place them in different locations entirely. What matters is that they arrive in California's gold country, stake a claim, and begin mining. At first, it goes well. Joaquín, the story says, has a natural talent for finding gold. He's lucky or skilled at reading the land, or simply works harder than most. He finds productive spots, accumulates gold dust and nuggets, starts building the fortune he dreamed of. His wife keeps their camp, cooks meals, perhaps helps with lighter mining tasks. They're making it work. The dream seems achievable. But California in 1849 and 1850 is not the land of equal opportunity that the gold rush mythology suggests. It's a place of intense racial tension and violence, where different groups compete for limited resources and where power determines who gets to keep what they've found. The new American arrivals flooding into California bring with them the racial attitudes common in 1850s America, which is to say, deeply racist attitudes that ranked people hierarchically by race and ethnicity, with white Americans on top and almost everyone else considered inferior. For Mexicans in California, the situation is particularly complex and painful. Until 1848, California was part of Mexico. Mexican settlers had lived there for generations. They owned land, ran businesses, governed towns, built the infrastructure of colonial society. Then, the Mexican-American War ended with Mexico's defeat and California's transfer to the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that formalized this transfer included provisions supposedly protecting Mexican residents' rights. They could become American citizens, their property would be respected, they would be treated fairly under American law. In practice, these provisions were almost universally ignored. Mexican landowners found their property claims challenged in American courts that didn't recognize Mexican land grant procedures. Mexican business owners faced discrimination and violence. Mexican miners were treated as foreigners despite living in what had been their own country just years before. The American newcomers generally regarded Mexicans as racially inferior, culturally backward, and unwelcome competitors for gold. This is the California that Joaquín Murrieta discovers beneath the surface of his initial success. The discrimination starts small: insults, suspicious looks, being charged higher prices than American miners. Then it escalates. In 1850, California passes the foreign miners' tax, ostensibly applying to all foreign miners, but enforced almost exclusively against Mexicans and Chinese. The tax is $20 per month, an enormous sum when gold dust sells for about $16 per ounce, and many miners are lucky to find an ounce per week. The tax is designed to drive non-American miners out of the goldfields, and it succeeds in that goal. Joaquín pays the tax, struggles to still make a profit, watches as Mexican miners around him are driven into bankruptcy or physically expelled from mining areas. He sees violence increasing, Mexican miners beaten by American claim jumpers, Mexican camps raided, Mexican merchants robbed with no legal recourse, because California courts rarely sided with Mexicans against Americans. He understands that the law, which theoretically should protect everyone equally, actually protects only some people, while leaving others vulnerable to exploitation and violence. The story of what happens next, what transforms Joaquín from an honest miner into an outlaw, varies significantly depending on which account you read. But all versions agree on certain elements: injustice, violence against Joaquín and his family, betrayal by American authorities who should have protected him, and a final breaking point where the peaceful man decides that if the law won't give him justice, he'll take it himself. The dream that brought him to California, the hope for prosperity, for a better life, for achieving something through honest work, that dream is about to die, and from its death, a legend will be born. The transformation of Joaquín Murrieta from peaceful miner to outlaw didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a series of injustices that accumulated until they overwhelmed whatever faith he had in American justice and law. To understand this transformation, we need to understand what life was like for Mexican miners in Gold Rush, California. Because Joaquín's experience, whether historically accurate in every detail or partly mythologized, reflects genuine patterns of discrimination and violence that thousands of Mexican people experienced during this period. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was just the beginning. This law required all foreign miners to pay $20 per month for the privilege of mining in California. On paper, it applied to all foreigners: French, German, Chinese, Mexican, anyone who wasn't an American citizen. In practice, enforcement was highly selective. Tax collectors, who received a percentage of what they collected, targeted Mexican and Chinese miners almost exclusively, while rarely bothering European immigrants. The reason was partly racial prejudice and partly practical. Mexicans and Chinese were more vulnerable because they faced more discrimination, had fewer legal protections, and could be intimidated more easily than Europeans who might have better connections or more readily accepted whiteness. $20 per month was a crushing burden. An average miner working a moderately productive claim might find 1 ounce of gold per week. With gold prices around $16 per ounce, that's $64 per month gross income. Subtract the mining tax, you're down to $44. Then subtract food, equipment, supplies, and other costs, and many Mexican miners found themselves working for almost nothing or actually losing money. Some paid the tax and struggled. Others tried to avoid the tax collectors, hiding when collectors came through mining camps or moving frequently to stay ahead of them. Still others gave up entirely and left the goldfields, returning to Mexico or moving to California cities where they tried to find other work. Joaquín, according to the legend, paid the tax at first. He was lawful by nature, wanted to do things properly, believed that if he followed the rules, he would be protected by them. But paying the tax severely reduced his income, making it harder to save money for the future he dreamed of. And he watched as American miners who worked claims right next to his paid no such tax, gave them an enormous competitive advantage. The injustice of it gnawed at him. Why should he pay simply for being Mexican? Why was he being punished for his ethnicity when he worked just as hard, mined just as honestly, broke no laws? The tax was bad enough, but the violence was worse. Gold Rush, California was a lawless place, even for white American miners, with frequent disputes over claims, vigilante justice, gunfights, and lynch mobs. For Mexican and Chinese miners, it was exponentially more dangerous because violence against them was rarely punished. American miners who wanted a productive claim could simply attack the Mexican or Chinese miners working it, beat them or threaten them into leaving, and take over the claim. If the victims complained to authorities, they were usually ignored or told to just accept the situation. Some Mexican miners tried to fight back, which sometimes resulted in their deaths. Others fled without fighting, abandoning everything they'd worked for. Joaquín witnessed this pattern repeatedly. He saw Mexican miners beaten. He saw claims stolen. He saw authorities turn away Mexican complaints while taking American complaints seriously. He understood that the law, which theoretically applied equally to everyone, actually protected only Americans while leaving Mexicans vulnerable to exploitation. This created a moral crisis for someone who had believed in working within the system, following rules, trusting that justice would prevail. If the system was fundamentally unjust, what was a good man supposed to do? The breaking point comes differently in different versions of the Murrieta legend, but all versions include personal trauma that makes his situation unbearable. Some accounts say claim jumpers attacked Joaquín's mining operation, beat him severely, and stole his claim, while authorities refused to intervene. Some say he was falsely accused of horse theft, a convenient charge that Americans often leveled against Mexicans to justify violence against them, and was publicly whipped despite being innocent. The most dramatic versions include the assault of his wife, sometimes described as rape by American miners, and the murder of his brother or other family members who tried to defend her. We cannot verify which, if any of these specific incidents actually happened to a real person named Joaquín Murrieta. Mexican and Mexican-American communities in California certainly experienced all of these forms of violence during the gold rush. Mexican miners were beaten, sometimes to death. Mexican men were accused of crimes they didn't commit and punished without proper trials. Mexican women were sexually assaulted. Mexican families were murdered. These atrocities are documented historical facts, even if we can't definitively connect them all to one specific individual named Joaquín Murrieta. What matters for understanding the legend is that these experiences, whether they all happen to one man or represent composite trauma experienced by many Mexican people, transformed Joaquín's worldview completely. He had come to California believing in prosperity through honest work, believing that laws protected everyone fairly, believing that Americans would treat Mexicans as equals, especially since California had just been part of Mexico. All these beliefs were shattered by experience. He learned that honest work meant nothing if powerful people wanted what you had. He learned that laws protected some people while making others vulnerable. He learned that being Mexican in American California meant being treated as inferior, as disposable, as less than human. Faced with this reality, Joaquín had several options. He could leave California entirely, return to Mexico, give up on the dream that brought him north. Many Mexican miners made this choice, abandoning the goldfields after losing everything, going home poorer than they'd arrived. He could stay in California but avoid further trouble, accept his inferior status, try to survive by keeping his head down and not challenging the system that oppressed him. This was the path of survival, of accommodation, of trying to make the best of an unjust situation, because fighting back seemed hopeless. Or he could resist, could refuse to accept injustice, could fight back against the people and system that had destroyed his life. The legend says Joaquín chose resistance. Exactly when and why he made this choice varies by account, but the essential narrative remains consistent. At some point, the peaceful miner decided he would rather die fighting than live accepting oppression. He decided that if American law wouldn't protect him, he would protect himself. He decided that if Americans could rob him with impunity, he could rob them back. He decided that justice, if it couldn't be obtained through legal channels, would have to be taken by force. This decision is where the historical Joaquín Murrieta, if he existed, disappears and the legendary Joaquín Murrieta emerges. We transition from trying to understand a real person navigating real circumstances to trying to understand a symbol, a legend, a figure who represents more than any individual could be. Because the Joaquín Murrieta who becomes famous isn't just one man who decided to become an outlaw. He's a hero to Mexican people experiencing discrimination, a symbol of resistance against injustice, a fantasy of revenge against oppressors, a personification of the anger and pain that thousands of people felt but couldn't safely express. Before continuing with the legend, we should pause to consider why this legend emerged and what purpose it served. Mexican communities in Gold Rush, California were traumatized, oppressed, and largely powerless. They couldn't fight back collectively against American domination because Americans controlled the government, the courts, the law enforcement, and had superior numbers and weapons. They couldn't seek justice through legal channels because those channels systematically discriminated against them. They couldn't even safely express their anger because doing so might invite more violence. In this context, the Joaquín Murrieta legend provided something psychologically and culturally necessary, a story about someone who fought back and won, at least for a time. Someone who refused to accept oppression, who made the oppressors afraid, who took revenge for injuries, who redistributed stolen wealth, who protected the vulnerable. Whether one man did all these things, or many men did them, and stories about them coalesced around one name, the legend gave Mexican communities a hero when they desperately needed one. It gave them a story of resistance to pass down to children. It gave them hope that justice might be possible even when the law failed them. The legend also served as warning to Americans that oppression has consequences, that victims of injustice might become more dangerous than comfortable oppressors anticipated, that terrorizing people creates terrorists. This dimension of the Murrieta legend made American authorities anxious precisely because they understood its power. A legend about Mexican resistance might inspire more Mexican resistance. A hero who fought back successfully might encourage others to fight back. Stories can be as dangerous as weapons when they circulate among oppressed people, because stories create solidarity, provide models for action, sustain resistance across generations. So when we talk about Joaquín Murrieta becoming an outlaw, We're talking about multiple things simultaneously. We're talking about whatever historical person or persons took up banditry in early 1850s California. We're talking about how Mexican communities told stories about that banditry, shaping raw events into heroic narratives. We're talking about how those narratives served psychological and cultural needs. And we're talking about how American authorities responded to both the actual banditry and the legends surrounding it, trying to suppress both the man and the myth. The Joaquín who emerges from this moment of transformation is no longer the peaceful Sonora miner who came to California dreaming of honest prosperity. That man is dead, killed by the violence and injustice he experienced. In his place is something else: an outlaw, a bandit, a guerrilla fighter, a Robin Hood figure, a terrorist, depending on your perspective. He's someone who has decided that if society won't protect him, he doesn't owe society anything. Someone who will take by force what he couldn't obtain by honest work. Someone who will make his enemies afraid the way they made him afraid. And he won't fight alone. The legend tells us that Joaquín begins gathering followers, other Mexican men who suffered similar injustices, who lost families or property or dignity, who reached the same breaking point where dying while fighting back seemed preferable to living while accepting oppression. These men come from different places with different stories, but they share anger, grief, and determination to resist. They will become the Five Joaquíns, named after their leader, notorious throughout California, feared by Americans and celebrated by Mexicans as heroes of resistance. The war is about to begin. Not a conventional war with armies and battles, but a guerrilla conflict where Mexican outlaws strike quickly and disappear, where Americans can't tell friendly Mexicans from hostile ones, where vengeance creates more vengeance in an escalating cycle of violence. It will terrify American settlers and galvanize Mexican resistance. It will create a legend that outlives everyone involved, and it starts with one man's decision that he's suffered enough. The transformation of Joaquín Murrieta from victim to outlaw required more than just personal decision. It required gathering a group of men who shared his anger, his skills, and his willingness to risk everything for revenge and justice. The legend speaks of the Five Joaquíns, a bandit gang that terrorized California in the early 1850s. Though, as with everything about Murrieta, the details shift depending on who's telling the story. What remains consistent is that Joaquín built an organization, that this organization was formidable enough to challenge American authority in California, and that it became the focal point for both Mexican resistance and American anxiety during the Gold Rush period. Understanding how this gang formed requires understanding the social conditions that produced it. By 1851 and 1852, thousands of Mexican miners had experienced the same pattern of discrimination and violence that Joaquín allegedly suffered. They'd paid the foreign miners' tax, while Americans paid nothing. They'd been cheated out of profitable claims. They'd been beaten, robbed, falsely accused of crimes, sometimes killed with no legal consequences for their murderers. Many had given up and left California, but others remained, either unable to afford the journey home or unwilling to accept defeat, scraping by in mining camps or California towns, living in a state of resentment and suppressed rage. These men, and they were almost exclusively men because mining culture was overwhelmingly male, represented a population ready for recruitment into resistance. They had nothing to lose because they'd already lost everything. They understood violence because they'd experienced it. They knew the terrain because they'd been working and traveling through California's mining regions. They had networks of family and friends who might shelter them or provide information about American movements. All they lacked was leadership and organization. Joaquín Murrieta provided that leadership. According to legend, he began with a small group, maybe his brother or cousins if we accept versions of the story that include them. Maybe just a few friends he knew from Sonora or met in the mining camps. These initial followers shared something crucial beyond just grievances. They shared loyalty to Joaquín personally. They knew him as a decent man who'd been pushed too far, and that knowledge legitimized what they were about to do. They weren't just criminals seeking profit, they were righteous men seeking justice that the legal system had denied them. The early raids were probably small-scale and cautious. Perhaps they robbed American miners who cheated Mexicans. Perhaps they stole horses or cattle from ranchers who'd mistreated Mexican workers. Perhaps they targeted the camps of particularly notorious Mexican haters, teaching them that violence had consequences. These early actions would have served multiple purposes, providing the gang with resources they needed to continue operating, taking revenge against specific enemies, demonstrating to other Mexicans that resistance was possible, and testing whether they could actually get away with it. Apparently they could. California law enforcement in the early 1850s was scattered and ineffective, especially in the remote mining regions where Joaquín operated. There were few sheriffs, fewer deputies, no organized police forces as we'd recognize them today. What law enforcement existed was often corrupt, incompetent, or sympathetic to American miners, regardless of guilt or innocence. This meant that Mexican outlaws who struck quickly and disappeared into the countryside could operate with relative impunity as long as they were careful, as long as they had networks of support in Mexican communities, as long as they kept moving. The gang grew. Other Mexican men who'd suffered injustice heard about Joaquín, sought him out, asked to join. Some brought useful skills. Maybe one was an experienced horseman, another a skilled tracker, another particularly good with weapons. Some brought information about potential targets, a merchant who cheated Mexicans and now had wealth worth stealing, a mine owner who'd beaten Mexican workers, a camp of Americans who'd killed a Mexican man for no reason. The organization became more sophisticated, more capable, more dangerous. This is where the Five Joaquíns name emerges, and it's one of the most interesting aspects of the legend. Different accounts identify these five differently, but the most common version includes Joaquín Murrieta himself as the leader, plus 4 other men named Joaquín: Joaquín Valenzuela, Joaquín Ocamorena, Joaquín Carrillo, and Joaquín Botelier or Botiller. Whether these men all actually existed, whether they were all named Joaquín, whether there were actually 5 of them, or whether the number was symbolic, all of this is uncertain. But the name Five Joaquíns served an important function in both Mexican and American communities. For Mexicans, having 5 Joaquíns made the legend more powerful. It suggested that resistance was widespread, that multiple Mexican men were willing to fight back, that Joaquín Murrieta wasn't alone, but represented a movement. The proliferation of Joaquíns made the gang seem larger and more threatening than if it had just been one man. It also made the hero more immortal. If one Joaquín was killed, another could take his place, so the spirit of resistance could never be fully suppressed. For Americans, the Five Joaquíns name created confusion and fear. If there were multiple Mexican bandits, all named Joaquín, operating in different regions, how could authorities track them? How could they tell which crimes were committed by which Joaquín? Were there really 5, or were there more? The ambiguity made the threat seem larger and more diffuse. Every crime committed by a Mexican man might be attributed to one of the Joaquíns, whether accurately or not, inflating their legendary status while making law enforcement seem impotent. One figure who appears consistently in accounts alongside Joaquín Murrieta is Manuel Garcia, known as Three-Fingered Jack, because he was missing 2 fingers on one hand. Three-Fingered Jack serves in the legend as Joaquín's lieutenant, his most trusted ally, and his most brutal enforcer. Where Joaquín is portrayed as honorable, even in outlawry, stealing from rich Americans who'd stolen from Mexicans, killing in revenge for specific wrongs, treating Mexican civilians kindly, Three-Fingered Jack represents pure violence. He's described as sadistic, as torturing victims, as killing unnecessarily, as taking pleasure in cruelty. This moral distinction between Joaquín and Three-Fingered Jack is narratively important. It allows the legend to acknowledge that the gang committed brutal acts while preserving Joaquín's heroic status. The worst violence gets attributed to Three-Fingered Jack, who serves as a kind of moral shadow to Joaquín's light. Whether Manuel Garcia actually existed, whether he actually was unusually violent, whether he was really Joaquín's lieutenant, all questionable. But his role in the legend is clear. He's the bad outlaw who makes Joaquín look like a good outlaw by comparison. The gang's operations, as described in various accounts, combined elements of guerrilla warfare, organized crime, and social banditry. They would strike at night or in remote locations, attacking targets they'd carefully selected, stagecoaches carrying gold from mines to banks, wealthy merchants traveling between towns, mining camps owned by particularly hated Americans, ranches belonging to men who'd mistreated Mexican workers. They'd take what they could carry, gold, money, weapons, horses, and disappear before authorities could respond. Crucially, the legend emphasizes that they shared their stolen wealth with poor Mexican families. After a successful raid, Joaquín supposedly would distribute gold and money to Mexican miners who'd been cheated or Mexican families who'd been driven off their land. This Robin Hood dimension transforms the gang from simple criminals into social bandits, outlaws who steal from rich oppressors and redistribute to oppressed victims, who provide a kind of people's justice that the legal system denied. Whether this actually happened as often as the legend claims is questionable. But the fact that the legend includes it tells us what Mexican communities needed to believe about Joaquín. The gang's success depended on support from Mexican civilian populations. They needed people to shelter them, to warn them when authorities were coming, to provide food and supplies, to keep their secrets. This support came partly from fear. The gang could punish Mexican civilians who cooperated with Americans, but mostly from solidarity. Mexican communities saw the gang as fighting their fight, taking revenge for injuries they all shared, standing up to oppressors when nobody else would. So they protected the outlaws, lied to sheriffs about what they'd seen, created alibis, provided safe houses. This popular support made the gang far more difficult to catch than isolated criminals would have been. American authorities and newspapers began reporting on the Five Joaquíns' activities, and these reports grew increasingly alarmed as the gang's operation expanded. Stagecoach robberies increased. Murders of Americans in mining regions raised fears of widespread Mexican uprising. Ranches were raided, horses stolen, camps attacked. The violence was significant enough that it threatened to destabilize California's economy and social order. American settlers, who'd been confident in their dominance over Mexican populations, suddenly felt vulnerable. The authorities who were supposed to protect them seemed ineffective. This created a political crisis for California's government. The state had only recently been admitted to the Union, September 1850, and was still establishing functional institutions. Having Mexican bandits terrorize American settlers made the government look weak and incompetent. It threatened to discourage migration to California, which could slow economic development. It challenged the racial hierarchy that most white Americans took for granted. How could supposedly inferior Mexicans be defeating supposedly superior Americans? Something had to be done, and done decisively, to restore American control. The response was initially scattered and ineffective. Local sheriffs tried to track down the gang and failed. Posses of armed Americans searched mining regions and found nothing. The gang seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and vanish completely. Rumors spread that Joaquín had supernatural powers, that he could be in two places at once, that bullets couldn't kill him. These rumors reflected American frustration at their inability to stop him, but they also reflected genuine admiration, even from some Americans, for the gang's audacity and skill. For Joaquín Murrieta, or for the men operating under that name, this period must have been both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because they were succeeding, because they were taking revenge, because they were proving that Mexicans could fight back effectively. Terrifying because they knew it couldn't last, because every raid increased the likelihood they'd eventually be caught, because American authorities were growing more determined to stop them. They were living on borrowed time, and they probably knew it. But borrowed time was enough. Because even if they were eventually caught and killed, they were creating something that would outlast them. A legend of resistance that would inspire future generations. They were proving that oppression could be challenged, that victims could become fighters, that justice could be taken even when it was denied. And in Gold Rush, California, where thousands of Mexican people felt powerless and humiliated, that proof was more valuable than any amount of stolen gold. The Five Joaquíns were no longer just criminals. They'd become symbols, and symbols, unlike men, are very hard to kill. The California Rangers hadn't been formed yet, and Joaquín Murrieta's gang operated in what we might call their golden period. Successful, feared, seemingly untouchable. But to understand how they achieved this success, we need to understand their tactics. Because the Five Joaquíns didn't just randomly commit crimes. They employed sophisticated guerrilla warfare strategies that would have impressed military theorists, even if those strategies were learned through necessity rather than formal training. Guerrilla warfare, the word itself comes from Spanish, meaning little war, relies on mobility, surprise, local support, and intimate knowledge of terrain. Regular armies with their formations, supply lines, and conventional tactics struggle against guerrilla fighters who refuse to face them directly, who strike unexpectedly and disappear, who blend into civilian populations. The Five Joaquíns understood these principles instinctively, or perhaps learned them from Mexican military traditions dating back to resistance against Spanish colonial rule. Their first advantage was mobility. Gold Rush, California was vast and difficult terrain, mountains, valleys, forests, deserts, with few roads and scattered settlements. The gang traveled light and fast, primarily on horseback, and Joaquín's legendary horsemanship gave them additional speed. They could cover enormous distances quickly, striking in one region and being 100 miles away before authorities even knew a crime had occurred. This mobility made them unpredictable and very difficult to track. Their second advantage was intelligence. They knew where gold was being transported when merchants would travel with money, which mining camps had recently struck rich deposits. This information came from Mexican workers and civilians throughout California who sympathized with the gang or feared them enough to cooperate. A Mexican miner might overhear Americans discussing a gold shipment and pass that information along. A Mexican servant in an American household might learn about travel plans. A Mexican stablehand might notice when wealthy men prepared horses for a journey. This informal intelligence network gave the gang information that authorities lacked. Their third advantage was sanctuary. After raids, the gang would disappear into remote mountain areas or hide in Mexican communities that provided shelter. Authorities searching for them found nothing because Mexican civilians claimed ignorance, provided false information, or actively misdirected searches. This popular support was crucial. Without it, the gang would have been caught quickly. With it, they could operate for years, despite being California's most wanted criminals. Their operational pattern typically followed a cycle. They'd receive information about a target, maybe a stagecoach carrying gold from mining camps to San Francisco, or a wealthy rancher traveling with money to buy cattle. They'd plan the attack carefully, choosing the location based on terrain that favored quick strikes and fast escapes. mountain passes where targets had to slow down, isolated stretches of road far from help, areas with multiple escape routes. They'd position themselves in advance, wait for the target, strike suddenly, take what they wanted, and disappear before anyone could organize pursuit. The robberies themselves were reportedly swift and efficient. The gang would appear seemingly from nowhere, weapons drawn, demanding valuables. Most victims, outnumbered and surprised, surrendered without resistance. The gang would take gold, money, weapons, horses, anything portable and valuable, then vanish. The entire encounter might last only minutes, but the planning that made it possible took days or weeks of careful preparation. What made them particularly effective was their psychological understanding of their enemies. They knew that Americans in California, despite their dominance, felt vulnerable in certain contexts. A lone American merchant traveling through isolated country was vulnerable, regardless of his social status back in town. A small mining camp far from law enforcement was vulnerable despite being American-owned. The gang exploited these moments of vulnerability, teaching Americans that they weren't safe everywhere, that Mexican resistance existed and could strike any time. The legend emphasizes that Joaquín distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate targets. He supposedly avoided attacking poor Americans or those who treated Mexicans fairly, focusing instead on wealthy Americans who'd grown rich exploiting Mexican labor or stealing Mexican property. He allegedly never harmed women or children. He reportedly warned particularly hated targets before attacking them, giving them chances to reform their behavior. Whether these restrictions actually existed is debatable, but they're narratively important because they preserve Joaquín's moral legitimacy in the legend. Three-Fingered Jack, by contrast, is portrayed as having no such compunctions. Stories attribute the gang's worst excesses to him: unnecessary cruelty, attacks on innocents, violence beyond what robbery required. This moral division between Joaquín and Three-Fingered Jack allows the legend to acknowledge that the gang did terrible things while maintaining that Joaquín himself remained honorable. It's a narrative convenience that tells us more about what storytellers wanted to believe than about historical reality. But it served important functions in both Mexican and American communities. For Mexicans, having a hero who was violent but honorable, who broke laws but maintained moral standards, helped reconcile the contradiction of celebrating an outlaw. They could admire his resistance without endorsing all his methods, could support his goals while disapproving of his worst actions. The legend gave them permission to be proud of Joaquín by making him more complex than a simple criminal. For Americans, the Joaquín versus Three-Fingered Jack distinction created anxiety because it suggested that Mexican resistance had legitimate grievances. If Joaquín only attacked Americans who'd wronged Mexicans, then Americans needed to consider whether their treatment of Mexicans had been just. This was uncomfortable introspection that most Americans preferred to avoid, but the legend forced them to at least confront the question. The gang's success during this period was remarkable, but also created escalating problems. The more successful they became, the more pressure authorities faced to stop them. The more crimes attributed to them, whether they actually committed all those crimes or not, the more urgent the political need for action became. And the more legendary Joaquín became among Mexican communities, the more American authorities feared that legend might inspire broader Mexican resistance. By 1852 and early 1853, newspapers throughout California ran regular stories about the Five Joaquíns. Some stories were accurate reporting of actual crimes. Others were exaggerations or entirely fictional, attributing any crime committed by Mexicans to Joaquín's gang, whether they were involved or not. This created a feedback loop where Joaquín's legendary status grew far beyond his actual activities, which increased public demand that authorities do something. which increased pressure on California's government. American settlers in mining regions and rural areas became genuinely frightened. They'd come to California expecting to dominate Mexicans easily, expecting racial superiority would translate automatically into safety and control. Instead, they found themselves vulnerable to Mexican bandits who seemed uncatchable, who could strike anywhere, who might attack next week, or tomorrow, or tonight. This fear was politically powerful because scared voters demand action from their governments. California's political leadership understood they had a crisis. The state's reputation was at stake. Who would want to move to California if Mexican bandits terrorized settlers? The racial hierarchy was at stake. How could Americans maintain dominance if Mexicans successfully resisted? And their own political futures were at stake. Elected officials who couldn't protect settlers wouldn't remain elected long. Something had to be done, and conventional law enforcement had clearly failed. For Joaquín and his gang, this escalating pressure meant that their borrowed time was running out. They'd proven that Mexican resistance was possible, that oppressors could be challenged, that justice could be taken even when denied. But they'd also painted targets on their backs that were growing larger by the day. California's government was about to mobilize resources specifically to hunt them down. And once that happened, their advantages of mobility and surprise would diminish significantly. The war phase of the Joaquín Murrieta legend was reaching its climax. The hunters were coming. The California Rangers were about to be formed with one mission: kill or capture Joaquín Murrieta by any means necessary. And when that happened, the guerrilla war would transform into something even more desperate. A manhunt that would end either with the gang's destruction or with California's humiliation. There was no middle ground anymore. The conflict had escalated too far for compromise or half measures. One side would win decisively, and the other would lose everything. While American newspapers portrayed Joaquín Murrieta as a bloodthirsty bandit and terrorist, Mexican communities throughout California told very different stories. To them, he wasn't a criminal, but a hero. Someone who protected the vulnerable, redistributed stolen wealth, and stood up for people who had no other protection. This dual reputation, villain to Americans, hero to Mexicans, is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Murrieta legend. And it tells us much about how communities create heroes to meet their psychological and cultural needs. The Robin Hood comparison is so obvious that it appeared even in 19th century accounts. Like the legendary English outlaw, Joaquín supposedly robbed from rich oppressors and gave to poor victims. Like Robin Hood, he operated outside the law because the law itself was unjust. Like Robin Hood, he maintained a moral code even while breaking laws. And like Robin Hood, he became more legend than man, with his actual history obscured by layers of storytelling shaped by what people needed him to represent. The stories Mexican communities told about Joaquín emphasized his generosity and protection of civilians. After successful robberies, he supposedly would seek out Mexican families who'd been driven from their mining claims or had lost breadwinners to American violence. He'd give them gold to help them survive, to buy supplies, to restart their lives. He'd leave bags of gold dust at the homes of widows whose husbands had been killed by Americans. He'd pay debts for Mexican miners who couldn't afford the foreign miners' tax, keeping them from arrest or expulsion from the goldfields. Whether these acts of generosity happened as frequently as legend claims is impossible to verify. Guerrilla movements often exaggerate their heroes' virtues while minimizing their flaws, and the Joaquín legend almost certainly involved such exaggeration. But the stories served crucial functions, regardless of their historical accuracy. They gave Mexican communities heroes when they desperately needed heroes. They provided hope that someone was fighting for them. They created narratives of justice in contexts where legal justice was unavailable. The legend also includes stories of Joaquín protecting Mexican civilians from American violence. Supposedly, he would learn that particular Americans had beaten Mexican workers or assaulted Mexican women, and he would seek those Americans out to deliver punishment that authorities wouldn't provide. He became a kind of alternative justice system for people who had no access to legitimate justice. An American rancher who cheated Mexican laborers might find his horses stolen or his property burned. An American miner who'd attacked a Mexican might receive a warning to leave California or face consequences. Americans who ignored such warnings sometimes disappeared entirely. These protection stories served important psychological functions. Mexican communities in California felt powerless against American dominance, unable to defend themselves through legal or political channels. The Joaquín legend gave them a fantasy of protection, a belief that someone powerful cared about them and would punish their oppressors. Whether that belief matched reality mattered less than the hope and dignity it provided. Having a protector, even a legendary one, helped people maintain self-respect in demoralizing circumstances. The legend includes remarkable stories about Joaquín's disguises and his ability to move freely through American society. Supposedly, he was extraordinarily handsome, well-educated, capable of passing as a wealthy Mexican gentleman when needed. He could allegedly walk into American towns, dressed in fine clothes, mingle with Americans who were hunting him, learn their plans, and leave before anyone realized who he was. These disguise stories emphasize his intelligence and cunning, portraying him as always several steps ahead of his enemies. One famous story, possibly apocryphal but narratively powerful, describes Joaquín visiting a camp where Americans had posted a wanted poster offering reward money for his capture. He supposedly read the poster, laughed, told the Americans they'd never catch him, and rode away before they realized who he was. The story may be fiction, but it captures something true about the legend, that Joaquín wasn't just physically brave, but psychologically fearless, that he could mock his enemies to their faces, that he possessed supreme confidence in his own abilities. Mexican communities also told stories emphasizing Joaquín's respect for women and families. Unlike Three-Fingered Jack, who was portrayed as a monster, Joaquín supposedly never harmed women or children, never attacked families, never allowed his men to commit certain types of violence. These restrictions preserved his heroic status by distinguishing him from common criminals. A man who respected women and protected families could be celebrated as a hero, even if he broke other laws. A man who harmed innocents would be merely a villain, regardless of his grievances. The legend includes moments where Joaquín supposedly showed mercy to Americans who treated Mexicans fairly. An American merchant who charged Mexicans honest prices might be warned before a robbery and told to leave certain goods untouched. An American sheriff who tried to protect Mexican prisoners from lynch mobs might be spared when the gang attacked his town. These mercy stories reinforced that Joaquín wasn't fighting all Americans but only unjust ones, that he maintained moral distinctions, that his violence served justice rather than random hatred. For Mexican communities, these stories created a complete heroic narrative. Joaquín was brave but not reckless, violent but not cruel, lawless but not immoral. He was everything they needed him to be: a protector, an avenger, a symbol of resistance, a source of pride. He proved that Mexicans weren't powerless, weren't inferior, weren't destined to accept oppression passively. His existence, even if partly mythical, validated their dignity and maintained their hope for justice. American responses to Joaquín's popularity among Mexicans varied. Some Americans dismissed the Mexican hero worship as proof of Mexican barbarism and criminality. Of course, inferior people would celebrate an outlaw, they reasoned. But more thoughtful Americans recognized that Joaquín's popularity indicated deeper problems with how Americans treated Mexicans. If Mexicans celebrated a bandit, perhaps that suggested American society had failed to provide justice through legitimate channels. Perhaps it meant Mexican grievances were more serious than Americans wanted to acknowledge. Some American writers and journalists became fascinated by Joaquín despite themselves. They interviewed Mexican civilians who claimed to have met him, collected stories about his exploits, tried to separate fact from fiction. These Americans often portrayed Joaquín more sympathetically than their readers might have expected, acknowledging that he had genuine grievances even while condemning his methods. This ambivalent American response to Joaquín, simultaneous condemnation and fascination, suggests that some Americans understood, however uncomfortably, that their society's treatment of Mexicans had created the conditions that produced him. The nickname, the Robin Hood of El Dorado being California during the gold rush, captured this complexity perfectly. Robin Hood was an outlaw but a noble one, a criminal but a hero, someone who broke laws because the laws themselves were unjust. Calling Joaquín the Robin Hood of El Dorado acknowledged his outlaw status while suggesting his actions had legitimacy that ordinary crime lacked. It was a way of saying that Joaquín wasn't just a bandit, but something more significant, a symbol of resistance against oppression, a fighter for justice denied. Mexican communities throughout California created elaborate support networks for the gang, safe houses where they could hide, scouts who warned them of danger, suppliers who provided food and equipment, doctors who treated injuries without reporting them to authorities. This infrastructure of resistance meant the gang was never truly isolated, never without resources, never completely vulnerable to capture. As long as Mexican communities supported them, they could continue operating despite being hunted. This popular support also meant that Joaquín's legend grew constantly. Every time someone helped the gang, they became part of the story. Every family that received gold from Joaquín told their neighbors. Every Mexican who saw the gang and kept quiet felt connected to the resistance. The legend wasn't just about one man or one gang anymore. It was about an entire community's defiance of oppression, a collective assertion of dignity and worth. But this same popularity that protected the gang also ensured that California authorities would eventually mobilize overwhelming force against them. A criminal gang that nobody supported could be ignored as a minor nuisance. A gang supported by entire communities represented an existential threat to American control. It suggested that Mexican populations might organize broader resistance, that guerrilla war might spread beyond one gang, that American dominance over California might be challenged more seriously. California's government couldn't tolerate that possibility. So while Joaquín enjoyed his status as hero to the oppressed, while Mexican communities told stories about his generosity and courage, while the legend grew ever larger, the countdown to confrontation was accelerating. California was about to authorize formation of the Rangers specifically to hunt him down. The protection that popular support provided was real, but not unlimited. No amount of hiding places and warnings could protect the gang forever against determined, well-funded, legally authorized hunters. The golden period was ending. The final confrontation was approaching, and everyone involved probably understood that when it came, there would be no second chances. By early 1853, California's political establishment had reached a consensus. The Joaquín Murrieta problem required extraordinary measures. Conventional law enforcement, scattered sheriffs with limited resources, temporary posses of armed civilians, occasional military patrols, had completely failed to stop the gang or even significantly disrupt their operations. The Five Joaquíns continued raiding throughout California's mining regions and beyond, seemingly with impunity. Something dramatically different needed to be tried, and California's legislature decided that something would be the California Rangers. The authorization for this force came through state legislation passed in May 1853. The law specifically empowered Captain Harry Love, to recruit 20 men for a specialized unit whose sole mission would be hunting down Joaquín Murrieta and his gang. The Rangers would be funded by the state, given legal authority to operate throughout California, and promised reward money for success. This wasn't normal law enforcement. It was closer to a military operation against designated enemies of the state. Harry Love himself was an interesting choice to lead this effort. He was an experienced frontiersman, familiar with California's terrain, comfortable with violence, and ambitious for the glory that capturing or eliminating Joaquín would bring. He'd worked as a courier, fought in various frontier conflicts, and earned reputation as someone capable of surviving in harsh conditions while tracking enemies. He was exactly the kind of hard man that such a mission required, someone willing to pursue the gang relentlessly, regardless of difficulty or danger, someone for whom failure wasn't acceptable. Love recruited his 20 Rangers carefully, choosing men with specific skills needed for the mission. Some were excellent trackers who could follow trails across difficult terrain. Some were gunfighters comfortable with violence. Some spoke Spanish and understood Mexican culture well enough to gather intelligence from Mexican civilians. Some had personal grudges against Joaquín's gang. Perhaps they'd been robbed or had relatives hurt in raids, or simply hated Mexicans generally and saw this as an opportunity to hurt them legally. The Rangers represented something new in California law enforcement, a professional, well-funded, specifically targeted force that could devote full attention to a single objective. Previous efforts to catch Joaquín had been part-time, poorly coordinated, inadequately resourced. Sheriffs had other responsibilities beyond chasing bandits. Posses formed quickly and dispersed quickly. Military forces had limited jurisdiction and answered to different chains of command. The Rangers had none of these limitations. They existed solely to hunt the Five Joaquíns, and they could pursue that mission as long as necessary. Their operational approach combined several strategies. First, intelligence gathering. The Rangers would interview Mexican civilians, threaten them when necessary, pay informants, piece together information about the gang's movements and hiding places. Second, persistent pursuit. Unlike posses that gave up after a few days, the Rangers would track the gang for weeks or months if needed, wearing them down through relentless pressure. Third, overwhelming force. When they did locate the gang, they'd attack with sufficient numbers and firepower to ensure victory, rather than allowing the gang to escape through superior tactics. The formation of the Rangers dramatically changed the dynamics of the conflict. Previously, the gang had enjoyed significant advantages in mobility and local knowledge. They could strike and disappear before authorities organized responses. They could hide in Mexican communities that protected them. They could stay ahead of pursuers through speed and clever use of terrain. But the Rangers were specifically designed to counter these advantages. They were mobile enough to keep pace with the gang. They had resources to maintain pursuit indefinitely. They had legal authority to do whatever was necessary to accomplish their mission. For Joaquín and his gang, the Rangers represented an existential threat qualitatively different from previous dangers. Being hunted by temporary posses was manageable. They'd evade for a few days and the posses would give up. Being hunted by a permanent, professional force meant constant pressure with no relief, meant they could never truly rest, meant every safe house and supporter was at risk of exposure. The psychological toll of perpetual pursuit would be enormous even for hardened outlaws. The Rangers' tactics included putting pressure on Mexican communities that had sheltered the gang. They would visit Mexican settlements, interrogate residents, threaten consequences for anyone who helped the outlaws. This created difficult dilemmas for Mexican civilians who sympathized with Joaquín but feared Ranger retaliation. Some civilians stopped providing support, either from fear or because they calculated that the Rangers would eventually win and punishing them afterward would be worse than cooperating now. This erosion of popular support degraded the gang's intelligence network and reduced their safe havens. The Rangers also used informants aggressively. They offered reward money to anyone who provided useful information, creating incentives for betrayal. They pressured captured gang associates to reveal locations and plans in exchange for leniency. They spread misinformation to confuse the gang and make them paranoid about who they could trust. These tactics were effective but morally questionable, involving threats, bribery, and exploitation of desperate people. But the Rangers' mission wasn't to be ethical. It was to succeed by any means necessary. As spring turned to summer in 1853, the pursuit intensified. The Rangers followed leads throughout California's mining regions, always a step behind the gang, but never so far behind that the trail went completely cold. They learned the gang's patterns, identified likely targets for future raids, positioned themselves to intercept. They gathered intelligence about gang members' families and friends, learning who might shelter them or provide supplies. Slowly, methodically, they closed the net. For the gang, life became increasingly difficult. They couldn't stay in one place long because Rangers might discover them. They couldn't raid as freely because Rangers might ambush them. They couldn't trust Mexican communities as completely as before because Rangers pressured those communities intensely. The psychological strain must have been terrible. Constant movement, constant vigilance, constant awareness that capture or confrontation could come at any moment. Some gang members reportedly left during this period, deciding that survival meant abandoning Joaquín and trying to disappear into Mexican civilian populations or flee to Mexico entirely. Whether these desertions actually happened or were invented later to explain why the gang's numbers had diminished, they're narratively important because they show the Rangers' strategy working. The goal wasn't just to catch the gang in one dramatic confrontation, but to degrade their capability gradually, making them weaker and more vulnerable over time until they could be defeated decisively. Joaquín himself, according to the legend, remained defiant even as pressure increased. He supposedly told his remaining followers that they'd continue fighting, that surrendering or fleeing meant admitting defeat, that dying while resisting was better than living in submission. Whether he actually said such things, whether he actually believed them, whether he recognized that their situation was becoming hopeless, all uncertain. But the legend needed him to be brave to the end, needed him to embody resistance, even when resistance became clearly futile. By July 1853, the pursuit had been ongoing for 2 months. The Rangers had accumulated information, narrowed possibilities, identified areas where the gang might be hiding. They were closing in on a confrontation that would end the chase one way or another. And somewhere in California's remote hill country, Joaquín Murrieta and his remaining followers were running out of places to hide and time to escape. The final showdown was imminent, and everyone involved probably understood that when it happened, some people wouldn't survive. The summer of 1853 was brutally hot in California's interior regions, the kind of heat that makes physical exertion exhausting and pursuit relentless, almost unbearable. But Captain Harry Love and his Rangers pushed forward regardless of discomfort, following leads and tracking movements with determination that bordered on obsession. They understood that Joaquín Murrieta's gang was weakening under sustained pressure, that the gang's support networks were fracturing, that success was possible if they maintained intensity. They'd been authorized and funded specifically for this mission, and failure would mean professional humiliation. Success, by contrast, promised fame and reward money significant enough to change their lives. The intelligence the Rangers gathered painted a picture of a gang that was struggling. Informants reported that the gang's numbers had decreased, whether through desertion, arrest, or other attrition. The remaining members were reportedly tired, stressed by constant pursuit, running low on supplies and safe havens. They'd been driven from familiar territories into more remote, less hospitable regions, where support from Mexican communities was limited because fewer Mexicans lived there. This geographic isolation made the gang more vulnerable because they couldn't rely on warnings from civilian supporters about ranger movements. Love developed theories about where the gang might be headed based on geography and logic. If they were being pushed out of mining regions, they might head toward California's coast, where they could potentially escape by sea. Or they might head south toward Mexico, trying to cross the border before rangers caught them. Or they might retreat into extremely remote mountain areas where pursuit would be difficult, gambling that rangers would eventually give up rather than chase them into wilderness. Love positioned scouts to watch likely routes and prepare to respond quickly when the gang was spotted. In mid-July, rangers received reports from multiple sources about suspicious activity near Panoche Pass, a remote location in the Diablo Range east of Monterrey. Mexican travelers had seen riders who might be gang members. Other reports mentioned camps in hidden valleys accessible through the pass. The information was fragmentary and uncertain, but it suggested the gang might be using that area for temporary refuge. Love decided to investigate, gathering his rangers for a march toward Panoche Pass. The approach was cautious and methodical. Love understood that if the gang was actually there, they might detect rangers approaching and flee before confrontation became possible. The rangers traveled quietly, avoided obvious routes, used terrain to conceal their movements. They gathered more intelligence as they approached. A Mexican shepherd had seen riders. Smoke from campfires had been spotted. Horses had been heard in areas where horses shouldn't be. These accumulating details increased confidence that the gang was nearby. On July 25, 1853, the rangers finally located what appeared to be the gang's camp. Multiple men were visible, along with horses and equipment, suggesting they'd been there several days. The camp's location made sense strategically. It was remote, defensible, with multiple escape routes if attack came from predictable directions. But Love had positioned his rangers carefully, surrounding the area as much as terrain permitted, blocking the most obvious escape routes. When he gave the order to move in, the rangers would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the gang before they could organize effective resistance or escape. What happened next is described differently in different accounts, but all versions agree on certain basic facts. There was a confrontation between rangers and gang members. The confrontation was violent. Several people on both sides were hurt. When it ended, the rangers claimed victory, announcing they'd eliminated Joaquín Murrieta and several gang members, including Three-Fingered Jack. But here's where the story becomes deeply problematic and where historical truth becomes almost impossible to determine with confidence. Did the rangers actually encounter Joaquín Murrieta at Panoche Pass? Did they eliminate the real gang, or did they attack different Mexican men and claim they were the gang? Was Joaquín Murrieta even present? These questions have been debated for more than 160 years without definitive resolution. The evidence the rangers presented to prove their success was macabre and controversial. They claimed to have taken the head of the man they identified as Joaquín Murrieta and the hand of the man they identified as Three-Fingered Jack. These body parts were preserved in jars filled with alcohol, a common preservation technique in the 19th century before modern embalming, and displayed publicly as proof of the gang's elimination. The rangers sought reward money from California's government and wanted to tour these gruesome trophies to collect additional money from curious spectators. But many people who'd known Joaquín Murrieta, or claimed to have known him, insisted the head in the jar wasn't his. They said the facial features were wrong, the age seemed wrong, various details didn't match. Some Mexican communities refused to believe Joaquín was gone, insisting he'd escaped and the rangers had killed someone else. Without modern forensic techniques like DNA analysis or dental records, proving identity definitively was impossible. People believed what they wanted to believe, based on their own interests and biases. From one perspective, the Rangers had every incentive to claim success, whether or not they'd actually found the real gang. They'd been pursuing Joaquín for months with significant public attention. Failure would be humiliating and would mean no reward money. If they encountered Mexican men in remote areas who might plausibly be gang members, declaring victory and taking body parts as proof served their interests perfectly, regardless of whether they'd actually eliminated the right people. From another perspective, the Rangers were professional enough to recognize Joaquín if they'd encountered him, or would have been able to confirm identity through investigation. The camp they attacked had characteristics consistent with an outlaw gang: remote location, defensive positioning, multiple armed men, stolen goods potentially present. It's quite possible they did find the actual gang and eliminated them exactly as claimed. The truth is, we'll never know with certainty. The historical record is too fragmentary, too contradictory, too shaped by people's biases and interests to support confident conclusions. What we can say is that after July 1853, the Five Joaquíns stopped operating as an organized gang. Whether that's because the gang was actually eliminated at Panoche Pass, or because surviving members decided continuing was too dangerous and disappeared into civilian life, the practical effect was similar. The crime wave attributed to Joaquín Murrieta ended. California's government accepted the Rangers' claims and paid the reward money they'd been promised. The head and hand were displayed in various California locations, attracting crowds of curious spectators who paid admission fees to view them. These exhibitions were both popular entertainment and political theater. They demonstrated that California's government could protect settlers, that Mexican resistance could be defeated, that law and order had been restored. Whether the displays were authentic or fraudulent mattered less than the message they sent. For Mexican communities in California, responses varied. Some people believed Joaquín was truly gone and mourned his loss as a tragedy. Others insisted he'd escaped and celebrated his survival. Still others became more skeptical, suggesting the entire Joaquín Murrieta story had been exaggerated or partly fictional from the beginning. But regardless of these differing interpretations, the practical result was that Mexican communities lost their most prominent symbol of resistance. Whether or not Joaquín was actually gone, the legends surrounding him changed after July 1853, becoming more about the past than the present. The Rangers disbanded after claiming success, having accomplished their mission as far as California's government was concerned. Harry Love achieved the fame he'd sought, though his later life was troubled and he eventually died in circumstances different from what his moment of glory might have predicted. The other Rangers returned to various pursuits, some remaining in law enforcement, others drifting into different occupations. They'd played their part, history, but history was finished with them once that part concluded, and Joaquín Murrieta, or the legend of Joaquín Murrieta, entered a new phase. No longer a living outlaw, but a dead hero. No longer a present danger, but a past symbol. No longer someone who might ride into town tomorrow, but someone whose story could be told and retold, shaped and reshaped to serve whatever purposes different communities needed. The man, if he ever existed as described, was probably gone, but the legend was just beginning its most influential phase. Few historical artifacts are as simultaneously ghoulish and fascinating as the severed head allegedly belonging to Joaquín Murrieta, preserved in a jar of alcohol and displayed publicly throughout California in the late 1850s and beyond. This grotesque trophy represents both the literal end of one story and the beginning of another, the transformation of a person, or legend of a person, into a symbol that could be packaged, sold, exhibited, and debated endlessly. The head in the jar became, in its own way, more famous than Joaquín himself had been during his life, and its eventual mysterious disappearance only added to the legend's enduring power. The preservation technique the rangers used, placing the severed head in a glass jar filled with alcohol, was common practice in 19th century medicine and specimen collection. Before modern embalming, alcohol preservation allowed bodies or body parts to be kept relatively intact for extended periods. Medical schools used this technique for anatomical specimens. Traveling shows used it for curiosities displayed for profit. The technique was scientifically sound for its time, even if modern sensibilities find it disturbing. Captain Harry Love and his rangers understood the head's commercial potential immediately. They'd been promised reward money from California's government for eliminating Joaquín's gang, but they recognized that public exhibition could generate additional income. Thousands of Californians were curious about Joaquín Murrieta. He'd been the subject of newspaper stories, campfire tales, anxious conversations for years. Many people wanted to see proof he was really gone. Charging admission to view the head and the preserved hand of Three-Fingered Jack could be lucrative. The exhibitions began shortly after the Rangers' return from Panoche Pass. They displayed the head and hand in various California towns, advertising the head of Joaquín Murrieta, the terror of California, or similar sensational language designed to attract crowds. Admission was typically 50 cents, a significant sum, but one that many people were willing to pay for such a sensational attraction. The exhibitions drew large crowds, mixing morbid curiosity with historical interest, with desires to confirm that a frightening threat had been eliminated. But controversy surrounded the head from the beginning. Mexican individuals who'd claimed to know Joaquín insisted this wasn't him. They said the facial features were wrong, the nose too broad, the jaw too square, the age too young or too old. Some claimed Joaquín had distinctive characteristics like scars or birthmarks that the head lacked. Others said they'd seen Joaquín alive after the date Rangers claimed to have eliminated him, suggesting either the head belonged to someone else or that Joaquín hadn't died at Panoche Pass at all. These skeptical voices were largely dismissed by American authorities and much of the American public. California's government had accepted the Rangers' claim and paid the reward money. Newspapers had reported Joaquín's demise as fact. American settlers wanted to believe the threat was over, suggesting the head might belong to someone else, that the Rangers might have made a mistake or perpetrated fraud, challenged official narratives that people preferred not to question. It was easier to accept that Joaquín was gone than to acknowledge continuing uncertainty. The Mexican community's insistence that the head wasn't authentic served multiple purposes beyond potential literal accuracy. It maintained hope that their hero might still live, might still represent resistance against oppression. It prevented complete American victory by denying them the satisfaction of confirmed success. It preserved ambiguity that made the legend more powerful. A dead hero could inspire, but a living or possibly living hero could inspire more intensely because his return remained imaginable. We need to acknowledge uncomfortable aspects of how this artifact was treated. A human head, regardless of whose head it actually was being displayed as entertainment and profit-generating spectacle. The person to whom that head had belonged, whether Joaquín Murrieta or someone else, was being reduced to a curiosity, stripped of dignity, treated as an object rather than remembered as a human being. This treatment reflected 19th century attitudes about death, exhibition, race, and entertainment that were different from modern sensibilities. But recognizing those differences doesn't eliminate the fundamental disrespect involved. The exhibitions continued for years. The head was displayed in various locations, sometimes in museums, sometimes in saloons, sometimes in traveling shows. It became associated with California's gold rush history, a tangible artifact from a violent period that was already becoming mythologized, even as people who'd lived through it were still alive. For tourists visiting California, viewing the head became an attraction similar to visiting mining sites or hearing tales from old prospectors, a way to connect with California's legendary past. The hand attributed to Three-Fingered Jack was exhibited alongside the head, providing additional sensational appeal. The missing fingers supposedly confirmed this was the notorious Manuel Garcia, though skeptics noted that missing fingers weren't particularly rare. Accidents, fights, disease, all could result in finger loss. But the combination of head and hand created a more impressive exhibition than either alone would have been, and the proprietors emphasized their gruesome authenticity to justify admission fees. Various attempts were made over the years to definitively identify the head. People who'd known Joaquín were sometimes brought to examine it, though their conclusions varied conveniently depending on whether they wanted to believe he was gone. Photographers took images of the head, and these photographs circulated in books and articles about California history. Artists created sketches based on the head, contributing to visual representations of what Joaquín supposedly looked like. But without modern forensic techniques, conclusive identification remained impossible. The artifact's existence created interesting legal and ethical questions. Who owned the head? Did the rangers own it as spoils of their mission? Did California's government own it since they'd paid reward money? Did Joaquín's family, if he had surviving family, have rights to claim it for proper burial? These questions were never satisfactorily resolved, in part because acknowledging them seriously would require treating the head as human remains deserving dignity rather than as property or curiosity deserving exhibition. As decades passed, the head's location changed multiple times. It was displayed in San Francisco, in various museums, in private collections. It survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire that destroyed much of the city, though records are unclear about exactly where it was stored during that disaster. Some accounts claim it was in a museum that burned, others that it was in a private collection that survived. The inconsistent stories add to, rather than detract from its legendary status. A mysterious artifact with mysterious history perfectly suited to a legendary figure. Then, at some point, accounts vary on exactly when the head disappeared. Some stories claim it was destroyed in a fire. Others say it was stolen. Still others suggest it was quietly buried by someone who decided it deserved respectful treatment finally. The disappearance mirrors Joaquín's own ambiguous fate. Did he die at Panoche Pass or escape? We don't know. Did his head burn or get stolen or get buried? We don't know. The layers of uncertainty compound perfectly. The head's disappearance actually enhanced rather than diminished the Joaquín Murrieta legend. A physical artifact could potentially be scientifically tested with modern techniques, potentially providing definitive answers about identity and fate. But an artifact that's disappeared can never be tested, can never provide definitive answers, ensures the mystery remains perpetual. It's almost narratively perfect. The head that might have proven or disproven the legend instead vanished, leaving only questions. Modern scholars and descendants of California Mexican communities have debated the ethics of the head's exhibition and the appropriateness of trying to locate it if it still exists somewhere. Some argue it should be found and buried properly with appropriate ceremony, providing dignity that was denied for more than a century. Others suggest that if it's truly lost, perhaps that loss is appropriate conclusion to a story that was always more legend than history, always more symbol than literal truth. The head in the jar represents ultimately how societies transform people into symbols and symbols into commodities. Joaquín Murrieta, whether he was one man or many men or partly fiction, became a head in a jar that people paid to view. That head became itself legendary, its fate as mysterious as the man's fate. And now, both the man and the head exist primarily as stories we tell about California's past, about justice and injustice, about how oppression creates resistance, and resistance creates legends that outlast everyone involved. The head is gone, probably forever, but the questions it represented remain very much alive. The story of Joaquín Murrieta didn't end with his alleged demise in 1853. Instead, it entered its most influential phase, transforming from contemporary news into historical legend, from California story into international symbol. Within a year of the Panoche Pass confrontation, the first biography appeared. Over subsequent decades, Joaquín became the subject of books, plays, poems, songs, and eventually films. He inspired one of fiction's most famous characters, influenced how Americans and Mexicans understood their shared history, and became a symbol of resistance that transcended his specific time and place. Understanding why his legend grew so dramatically helps us understand how societies create and use myths to make sense of their past and present. The first major published account came remarkably quickly. In 1854, just 1 year after Joaquín's reported demise, John Rollin Ridge published The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murrieta, the celebrated California bandit. Ridge himself was Cherokee, born in Georgia but forced to Indian territory by removal policies, eventually making his way to California during the gold rush. His own background, as someone from a displaced and oppressed people, may have influenced how he portrayed Joaquín, with considerable sympathy despite the criminal subject matter. Ridge's book established many elements that became permanent parts of the Murrieta legend. It portrayed Joaquín as initially peaceful and law-abiding, driven to outlawry by injustices suffered at Americans' hands. It emphasized his exceptional physical abilities, his horsemanship, his courage, his tactical brilliance. It included the Robin Hood elements of helping poor Mexicans while targeting wealthy Americans. And crucially, it depicted Joaquín as fundamentally honorable even while breaking laws, as a man whose criminal career was justified by the injustices that provoked it. Ridge's portrayal resonated powerfully because it addressed uncomfortable truths about Gold Rush California, while packaging those truths in adventure story format. American readers could enjoy tales of daring raids and narrow escapes, while being gently confronted with questions about how Americans had treated Mexicans. Mexican readers found validation of their grievances and a hero who represented their dignity and resistance. The book succeeded commercially precisely because it satisfied multiple audiences with different needs. But Ridge's book also took significant creative liberties with whatever historical facts existed. He embellished extensively, invented dialogue and scenes, shaped events to create narrative drama, and possibly combined stories about multiple people into a single protagonist. This meant that while Ridge's book became the foundation for subsequent Murrieta literature, it was already more fiction than history, more legend than biography. Every retelling that followed would compound these distortions, moving the story further from whatever truth might have existed. The Joaquín legend spread beyond California remarkably quickly. By the 1860s and 1870s, Spanish-language versions of his story circulated throughout Mexico and Latin America. He became a pan-Hispanic hero, representing not just California Mexicans, but all Latino people facing discrimination in the United States. His story was adapted and modified to speak to different regional contexts. Sometimes he was explicitly Mexican, sometimes more broadly Latin American, sometimes indigenous rather than Spanish in heritage. These variations show how malleable legend is, how it adapts to serve whatever purposes different communities need. In Mexico, Joaquín became a patriotic symbol. He represented Mexican resistance against American expansion and oppression. a hero who fought back against the nation that had seized half of Mexico's territory. His story was taught in schools, celebrated in corridos, traditional ballads, invoked in political rhetoric about Mexican dignity and independence. Whether the historical Joaquín had been particularly patriotic or nationalistic was irrelevant. The legendary Joaquín served Mexican nationalism perfectly by embodying resistance against American power. The legend also spread into American popular culture despite Joaquín's status as an outlaw who targeted Americans. Something about his story fascinated even the descendants of the people he'd supposedly robbed. Perhaps Americans were attracted to the romance of the outlaw, the adventure of his exploits, the drama of his reported demise. Perhaps they unconsciously recognized that his story exposed uncomfortable aspects of American behavior during California's founding. Whatever the reason, Joaquín became part of American myth alongside other famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James. This brings us to perhaps the most significant development in the Murrieta legend's evolution: his influence on the creation of Zorro. In 1919, writer Johnston McCulley published The Curse of Capistrano, introducing the character of Don Diego Vega, who becomes the masked vigilante Zorro. The parallels to Joaquín Murrieta are unmistakable. California setting, Mexican hero, fighting against corrupt authorities and defending oppressed people. Exceptional swordsmanship and horsemanship. Double identity, allowing him to move in society while conducting secret resistance. McCulley likely knew Joaquín Murrieta's story and borrowed elements consciously or unconsciously. But Zorro became something different, a purely fictional character who could be controlled completely by his creators, who never had to reconcile with messy historical reality, who could be purely heroic without the complications real outlaws inevitably have. Zorro became extraordinarily popular through films, television, books, comics, reaching global audiences that would never have encountered Joaquín Murrieta directly. In this way, Joaquín's legacy spread far beyond what the historical or legendary figure himself achieved, influencing popular culture internationally through his fictional descendant. The relationship between Joaquín and Zorro illustrates how legends evolve and spawn new versions. Joaquín inspired Zorro, but then Zorro influenced subsequent retellings of Joaquín's story, with some versions incorporating Zorro-like elements that may not have been present in earlier accounts. The two figures became intertwined in public imagination, each reinforcing the other, creating layered mythology where separating originals from derivatives becomes nearly impossible. Throughout the 20th century, the Murrieta legend continued evolving. He appeared in novels, poems, plays, films. Each generation reinterpreted him according to their own concerns and values. During periods when Chicano activism was prominent, Joaquín was portrayed as a proto-civil rights leader fighting for Latino dignity. During periods focused on Western mythology, he became primarily an outlaw adventure figure. During times of immigration debates, he represented undocumented people resisting unjust treatment. The legend's flexibility allowed it to remain relevant across changing contexts. Academic historians struggled with how to treat Joaquín Murrieta. He was clearly important in California and Mexican-American history, but separating fact from fiction was nearly impossible. Some historians dismissed him as mostly or entirely fictional, arguing that serious historical work should focus on documented facts. Others argued that the legend itself was historically significant, regardless of underlying facts, that how communities remember and mythologize the past tells us important things about those communities. This methodological debate continues today without full resolution. For Mexican-American communities, especially in California, Joaquín remained an important cultural symbol. Streets, schools, and cultural centers were named after him, His story was taught as heritage, as a reminder of discrimination faced by earlier generations and resistance against that discrimination. Annual commemorations celebrated him. Artists depicted him in murals and sculptures. He became part of cultural identity, a historical anchor connecting contemporary Mexican Americans to California's past, when their ancestors had been oppressed but had resisted with dignity and courage. But the legend also faced criticism. Some argued it glorified criminal violence and potentially encouraged lawlessness. Others suggested it reinforced negative stereotypes about Mexicans as prone to banditry. Still others worried that focusing on one controversial figure diverted attention from other Mexican Americans who'd contributed positively to California's development through peaceful means. These criticisms remind us that legends are never politically neutral, that they serve some purposes while potentially undermining others. The ambiguity about whether Joaquín actually existed and whether stories about him are accurate ultimately enhances rather than diminishes his legendary status. A clearly documented historical figure has limitations. We know what they did and didn't do, can judge them by actual actions, must reconcile heroic moments with contradictory evidence. A legendary figure, unconstrained by definitive facts, can be whatever people need them to be. Joaquín's ambiguity made him infinitely flexible, capable of representing whatever causes needed a historical hero to legitimize them. In the 21st century, the Murrieta legend continues evolving. He appears in contemporary literature, in historical documentaries, in academic studies, in political rhetoric. His story is taught in schools, discussed in museums, debated by scholars. He remains controversial, some seeing him as hero, others as criminal, most recognizing he's probably both or neither, depending on which version of his story you follow. But the controversies keep his legend alive. As long as people argue about Joaquín Murrieta, debate what he represents, use his story to make points about justice and injustice, the legend continues, serving the same functions it served originally, giving voice to oppressed people, challenging comfortable narratives, reminding us that history is always more complicated than simple stories suggest. We've reached the end of our journey through the Joaquín Murrieta legend, and now we need to ask the most important questions. What does this story mean? Why does it continue to matter more than 170 years after the events it describes? And what can Joaquín Murrieta, whether historical figure, legendary creation, or some combination, teach us about justice, resistance, memory, and how societies grapple with uncomfortable aspects of their past? Let's start with the historical context we've been exploring throughout these episodes. Gold Rush, California, was a place and time of extraordinary violence, racism, and injustice. The United States had just seized California from Mexico through military conquest. Mexican residents who'd lived there for generations suddenly found themselves subject to American authority, American laws, American prejudices. The gold rush brought hundreds of thousands of new arrivals who treated California as empty land to be exploited regardless of who'd been there before. Native Americans were slaughtered systematically. Chinese immigrants faced violence and discriminatory laws, and Mexicans, despite treaty provisions supposedly protecting them, were treated as unwelcome foreigners in what had been their own country just years earlier. Into this context, the Joaquín Murrieta legend emerged. Whether one man named Joaquín Murrieta did everything attributed to him, or whether multiple men's actions were combined, or whether significant portions of the story were invented, the legend addressed real grievances felt by real people experiencing real oppression. It gave Mexican communities a hero when heroes were desperately needed, a symbol of resistance when resistance seemed futile, proof that they weren't powerless, even when all evidence suggested they were. The legend's persistence tells us something important. Oppressed communities need heroes, need stories that validate their anger and pain, need evidence that resistance is possible, even when practical circumstances suggest otherwise. Joaquín became that evidence. His story, passed down through generations, told Mexican-American children that their ancestors hadn't accepted oppression passively, that they'd fought back with courage and skill, that they'd maintained dignity even in impossible circumstances. This intergenerational transmission of resistance narratives helps communities survive cultural oppression by maintaining self-respect and sense of worth. But we also need to acknowledge complicated aspects of celebrating an outlaw. Joaquín's legend involves criminal violence, robberies, attacks on people, defiance of law. American communities understandably saw him as a terrorist and criminal regardless of his grievances. Mexican communities saw him as a freedom fighter and hero despite his methods. This divergence in interpretation reminds us that one person's terrorist is often another person's freedom fighter. That legitimacy of violent resistance depends entirely on perspective and sympathy with the resistor's cause. This brings us to questions about when, if ever, violent resistance to injustice is justified. American revolutionary tradition celebrates violent rebellion against British colonial rule. American history lionizes figures who fought against oppression through force when peaceful methods failed. Yet those same traditions often condemn similar resistance by non-Americans or by marginalized groups within America. This inconsistency reveals that judgments about justified violence depend heavily on who's doing the judging and whose interests are served by particular narratives. Joaquín Murrieta forces us to confront this inconsistency. If violent resistance against oppression is heroic when Americans do it, why not when Mexicans do it? If breaking unjust laws is praiseworthy when challenging foreign tyranny, why not when challenging domestic injustice? The discomfort many people feel with these questions is itself instructive. It reveals that we haven't fully reckoned with the violence and injustice that founded American California, that we prefer comfortable myths over complicated truths. The legend also teaches about the power of ambiguity and mystery. The uncertainties about whether Joaquín existed, whether he died at Panoche Pass, whether the head in the jar was authentic. All these mysteries make the legend stronger than definitive facts would. A clearly documented person has limitations. We know what they did and didn't do, must judge them on actual record, can't easily project whatever meanings we want onto them. But an ambiguous legendary figure can be whatever different people need them to be, can represent multiple, sometimes contradictory values simultaneously, can remain relevant across changing contexts because the legend adapts while documented history is fixed. We should also consider what the legend reveals about how history gets written. The dominant narrative of Gold Rush California, as written primarily by American historians drawing on American sources, portrays it as an exciting period of expansion, opportunity, and nation-building. Joaquín Murrieta's legend provides a counter-narrative emphasizing violence, dispossession, and resistance. Both narratives describe the same time and place, but from radically different perspectives. The truth is that both are partially accurate. Gold Rush California was simultaneously an opportunity for some people and a catastrophe for others. Which narrative we emphasize reveals our values and sympathies. The legend's influence on popular culture, especially through inspiring Zorro, demonstrates how subversive ideas can spread through entertainment. Zorro stories, enjoyed by millions worldwide, carry embedded messages about resisting oppression, protecting vulnerable people, and fighting corrupt authority. These messages descend directly from the Joaquín Murrieta legend, meaning that his influence extends far beyond people who've heard of him specifically. Cultural transmission of resistance narratives often works this way, hidden in adventure stories, disguised as entertainment, but carrying ideological content that subtly shapes how audiences think about power, justice, and resistance. Modern relevance of the Murrieta legend remains strong because the issues it addresses persist. Mexican Americans and other Latino groups continue experiencing discrimination in the United States. Immigration debates continue arguing about who belongs in America and who doesn't. Racial injustice continues affecting people's opportunities and treatment. The specific circumstances that produced Joaquín's legend have changed, but underlying patterns of oppression and resistance continue, making the legend perpetually relevant as a symbol of fighting back against injustice. Some contemporary activists explicitly invoke Joaquín as an inspiration and model. They see his resistance as precedent for their own struggles, his courage as example to follow, his legend as proof that resistance is part of their cultural heritage. Others are more ambivalent, appreciating what he represents symbolically, while uncomfortable with celebrating violence. This diversity of responses is healthy. It means people are engaging seriously with the legend's complexities, rather than accepting it uncritically. We should be careful about romanticizing outlawry too much. Real banditry causes real harm to real people. The crimes attributed to Joaquín's gang, whether committed by him specifically or by others, hurt victims who didn't necessarily deserve targeting. Celebrating resistance shouldn't require ignoring harm to innocents or pretending that all violence by oppressed people is automatically justified. The most thoughtful engagements with the Murrieta legend acknowledge these complications while still recognizing his symbolic importance. The legend also reminds us about memory and commemoration. California has been slow to fully acknowledge the violence and injustice in its founding, to honestly reckon with how the state was built on dispossession and exploitation of multiple groups. Joaquín Murrieta's continued legendary status represents a kind of alternative memory-keeping, where communities maintain their own counter-narratives because official histories ignore or minimize their experiences. This pattern repeats throughout history. When official narratives exclude certain groups, those groups create their own stories and heroes to preserve memories that would otherwise be lost. Recent decades have seen increased efforts to include more diverse perspectives in California history, to acknowledge injustices more honestly, to create space for multiple narratives about the state's past. Joaquín Murrieta has benefited from these changes, appearing more frequently in museums, textbooks, public commemorations. But including his story in official history creates interesting tensions. How do you acknowledge someone as historically significant while admitting you're not sure he existed? How do you teach his story to students without glorifying violence or oversimplifying complicated issues? These aren't easy questions, but struggling with them is valuable. History education should be complicated because history itself is complicated. Students who learn about Joaquín Murrieta and grapple with uncertainties about fact versus legend, who consider whether his violence was justified, who examine different perspectives on his legacy, these students are learning to think critically about history, rather than just memorizing facts. The legend's complexities make it a better teaching tool than a simpler story would be. What, ultimately, should we conclude about Joaquín Murrieta? Perhaps the most honest answer is that he's multiple things simultaneously. He's possibly a real person who suffered real injustices and responded with real violence. He's definitely a legend that Mexican communities created to serve psychological and cultural needs. He's a symbol of resistance that continues inspiring people facing oppression. He's a historical mystery that may never be solved. He's a reminder of violence and injustice in California's past that Americans have preferred to forget. He's an outlaw and a hero, a criminal and a freedom fighter, depending on who's telling the story and why. The legend's greatest value may be precisely this multiplicity, this refusal to fit into simple categories. It forces us to think about perspective and sympathy, about how our judgments of right and wrong depend on who we identify with. It challenges comfortable narratives about American history by insisting that some people experience that history as catastrophe rather than triumph. It demonstrates that oppressed people create their own heroes when official society won't provide them. And it proves that legends can be as historically important as documented facts, that stories we tell about the past shape our present and future as much as what actually happened shapes them. Joaquín Murrieta, man, myth, symbol, ghost, rides through California's history and imagination still. His legend is immortal because it addresses truths that remain relevant, that injustice produces resistance, that oppressed people maintain dignity through memory and story, that history is always contested between different groups with different interests. As long as these truths matter, as long as people face injustice and fight back, as long as communities need heroes who represent their struggles, Joaquín Murrieta will remain alive in the stories we tell. The Bandit King of California has achieved a kind of immortality that the historical person, whoever he was, probably never imagined. His legend has transcended its origins to become something larger, a permanent part of how California, Mexico, and the United States remember and understand their complex, shared history. Whether he existed or not, he exists now, forever, in the collective imagination. And that existence, perhaps, is more important than any merely historical existence could ever be.